All right, thank you. All right, folks, if we could sit down, please. Home stretch, really. And a couple of quick housekeeping things. So first of all, as many of the contributors know, we're going to be doing a cool little partnership with University of Michigan's Journal of Electronic Publishing, aka JEP, so that the presentations will be made available online. So pretty much as a full media product whenever possible. So for all of the contributors, one of the things I would want to urge you is because it's electronic, we don't have to do this just because you were the guy speaking, you're the only person credited kind of model. So there's an opportunity for you to include people who have worked with you on the presentation in any way, shape, or form. And both Jep and I would encourage you to think broadly about contributorship when you work with them, and they will work with you directly on that. Tomorrow, Hack Day, so doors open at 8:30, starts at 9 o'clock. Again, you would have had to register for that already to be there, but we really look forward to seeing you there at Swiss Next at Montgomery and Columbus, 8:30 tomorrow morning. And that will go to about 4. I haven't been able to do this yet, but I'll steal 5 seconds and do it. I just want to acknowledge particularly the contribution of Kat Meyer, who made this program logical. To the extent that the talks have made sense where they are and that things have flowed so wonderfully together, it's all Kat, because I just looked at the incredible talks and titles and preliminary abstracts and went, ah, and Kat made it magic, so thank you. The magic of sticky notes. Thank you, 3M. And then finally, we do have some spare t-shirts left, so to the extent that you want to spread the goodness of BIB to your best friends and colleagues, you know, be reasonable, but take one for your bestest and spread the word. So thank you, and we'll be back after this round of talks, but for now, you ready? Okay, we have a joint talk. Looking forward to it, thanks.
We'll introduce ourselves. We're good to go. Hi, everybody.
Hello, everyone.
I'm John Maxwell. I teach publishing at Simon Fraser University. My colleague, longtime collaborator, Haig Armen, who's across town from me at Emily Carr University, an interaction designer and a teacher of interaction design. And we'd like to talk to you about the craft of the book in the age of the web today. It's an incredible honor to be here again this year, talking to this group of people. I'm so thrilled by this conference. I just come in here and it's just such a great pile of ideas and seamlessly, it seems woven into a sort of a coherent fabric by Peter and Kat. Thank you so much for that, you guys. It's a lovely thing to be. I think when I did my talk last year at Books and Browsers, I was at the very beginning of the first day, and so it was nice to have it over and done with. But we're in the sort of position now to reflect a little bit on what we've been hearing over the last 2 days. Haig and I have been kind of debating back and forth over the last couple of days whether we're preaching to the converted or not with this talk, and I think we'll just have to let you guys decide that. So we're teachers, and we have a vested interest in the future of publishing and books and related arts and crafts and things like that. So that kind of shapes where we're coming from with this. Oh, I have a handheld thing. I think this community is constituted around, obviously, the idea that in this day and age, books need browsers. It's 2013. We live in the age of the web. You need to have some kind of reconciliation of those two kinds of things. Books in browsers make sense. But do browsers actually need books, I think, is the more interesting question. And I want to dig into that one. And this idea about whether literature and the book and publishing are actually all the same related idea anymore. After last year's Books and Browsers talk, I had this kind of sense of liftoff, right? Especially at this conference, that somehow or another we were sort of leaving some of the luggage and the baggage and baggage, both kinds, leaving all of that stuff behind, and that literature was going to move forward, that we had a new idea of publishing. Maybe that was going to leave the industry behind. Maybe that was leaving the book behind. There was a kind of a neat sort of having taken off kind of feeling. That felt good. I felt that there was a kind of a post-industrial moment for publishing, and that was kind of an interesting idea. Later on, that same winter, I guess in the spring, Richard Nash wrote a beautiful article about the business of literature that talked about that conflation of the business part and what literature is about, and peeling those apart and looking at the history of that and how far back that goes, a lot farther than the industrial activity. James Bridle, another sort of Books in Browsers character for many years, I think has made a really interesting case over the last couple of years about how literature doesn't inhere in the work anymore, that literature now exists in the network, and he has that sense of the network with a capital N as a singular system, that's the internet and us. The literature now spans this global thing as opposed to the book or the work. Those are all pretty interesting ideas, and then I think you can put on top of that another layer, and that's the kind of schadenfreude that I think a lot of us have felt about the big, slow-moving, dinosaurish publishing industry that's apparently going to have its proverbial lunch eaten by more smaller, more agile startups, and that's kind of an interesting idea too. And maybe that all kind of points in a dodgy direction for the future of publishing. And yet we love books, right? And more than just loving books, I think there's a self-identification of book people. Where I teach at SFU, we have a master's program, a graduate program in publishing. And what I think attracts students to us is not what we teach particularly or what we do. It's a self-identification kind of thing. These are people that, they've been through their bachelor's degree, they've been out in the workforce for a few years maybe. They understand that what they love most of all is books and literature. And they want to make a career out of that thing, whatever that might be. Maybe that means making a career as an editor or a designer or a marketing person or a technologist or whatever. But what they want to be part of is that big cultural cluster that the book represents. Maybe it's magazines, but something in that big sort of organized practice, organized culture around the book and around literature in that way that it's been. All of those people are, they're savvy digital natives at this point, but that doesn't take away from that piece, which I think is what binds those people together. And I'm going to conjecture that that's what binds us together here as well, right? The people that come to this room, all of you are not here because you're worried about how to save the publishing industry. I think you're here because you love books. If you didn't love books, you'd all be at the Semantic Web Conference, right? But you're here. This is Books and Browsers. So I think what makes the book lovable and makes book culture lovable, in large part, is this idea of craft. So publishing is an industrial activity. It's possibly the original prototypical industrial activity, right? I mean, what Gutenberg set in motion in the 1450s kind of prefigures and sets a whole bunch of the dimensions for how the Industrial Revolution plays out. So publishing is certainly an industry and always has been an industry. And literature certainly is about art, but there is this really important third category that is neither of those, that's craft, right? That's about a bunch of things that's beyond storytelling and beyond curation and filtering and all of these other kind of functional things that we talk about publishing being about. There's a craft element about making things, and making things that last, that are durable. And that makes this grand tradition that spans 500 years or more. I mean, you could probably take it back a lot farther than Gutenberg even. But there's a grand tradition that inside of which it contains this incredibly immeasurable amount of wealth and wisdom about human expression and about how to do that. And that tradition is not just a bunch of ideas, but it's a tradition of making things. It's a tradition of craft and what it means to make things and how to do it well and all of that sort of thing. Craft is organized practice, right? It's organized around a common discourse. It's organized around a common language that allows us to talk about it in a collaborative process. The traditional kind of stereotype of craft, collaboration is the master and the apprentice, but it could as easily be a peer-to-peer kind of a collaboration. We certainly do it when we teach, teachers and students, that sort of thing. I think there's enough talk about collaboration even between creators and audiences, authors and readers. It's a collaborative thing. It unfolds in time. It's about making things and sharing things. We make things in order to be able to critique them, in order to learn from them, in order to improve upon them going forward in time. And that's what makes it a tradition. That's a long, long tradition. That is possibly the greatest tradition of our culture, is that long thing about making cultural expressions that last. That might be the definitive thing, maybe. So let me give you an example from some of the research that I've been doing. I've been working on a book on the ancient history of digital publishing technology. It's centered around this place, the Coach House Press, which is in Toronto. And it was established in 1965, and it was set up in that sort of counterculture era. All the smart Americans went to Canada in those days, apparently. There was a thriving counterculture and a literary movement in the late 60s. And the Coach House Press was set up as a fine printing house, a publisher of poetry, avant-garde literature, that sort of thing. And this is a craft house, right? This fella, Stan Bevington, established the press in 64, 65. He started out as a screen printer, and then he learned to set type by hand, and he learned to use the linotype machine. He was a darkroom innovator. They have just massive amounts of tricks and things that you could do in order to set type and do printing that are darkroom based. He's a tinkerer, right? And he gathered people like himself around him to build the community around the Coach House Press in the late 60s. Master printers, darkroom wizards, typesetters, designers, and with them poets and editors and writers and those sorts of people. So the Coach House is I think, a lovely example of an institution that's all about that grand tradition of printing and publishing, because they do it all. It's like the archetypal printing office from the Beatrice Ward broadside, you know, the crossroads of civilization, the refuge of all the arts against the ravages of time. It's that kind of a place, right? It's a nexus where culture happened. Writers, artists, printers, tinkerers, all these different kind of people came together in that sort of thing, and that's a grand tradition. So the interesting thing about the Coach House, and this is what my research is about, is that in 1974, they went digital in a big way. And there's a kind of a lovely little story about some alleged misappropriation of arts grant money that led to a wholesale investment in mini computers and photo typesetting gear that sort of set the stage for what they were going to do for a long time. Through the 70s and the 80s at the Coach House, they developed their own typesetting software. They were hardware hackers. They developed, by the early 80s, the leading Unix-based typesetting system. They spawned a software startup in 1984 called SoftQuad that went on to some fame and had a big hand in development of the world, the markup-based world that we all know today. They were printers and photographers and tinkerers and bricoleurs and hackers, and that's an unbroken chain, I think. They didn't see the computer as something different to what they'd been doing on the print floor. It was the same kind of a thing. And what motivated them through all of that was the idea of how do you make better books? How do you achieve a better editorial workflow that makes more sense to people? How do you get higher quality printing? How do you get better H&J? That was the kind of stuff that motivated them as software developers, as hackers. And that's what I worry about. I worry that we're going to lose that tradition as we go through the keyhole, right? This kind of Venturi moment as publishing goes through the little digital keyhole. As we go to this intensely commoditized things, and we end up with, you know, this paradigm that Amazon has defined. And anybody that cares at all about typography here will notice that we have the bottom of a quotation at the top of the screen, and then we have terrible rivers of white and a ridiculous thing with a footnote. I just popped open my Kindle and took a snapshot of that. This is good enough, right? This is good enough for the biggest publisher on earth, and I mean Amazon by that, right? These are the people that have all the mind share. It's good enough. They could make typography better on the Kindle if they wanted, but their data about what readers actually care about tells them this stuff doesn't matter. So the craft tradition does not matter to Amazon. And anybody that's also playing the game that Amazon is playing about chasing the bigger data and the bigger markets and that sort of thing. And that worries me, because that means that we may reinvent publishing for the 21st and the 22nd and the 23rd centuries, but does that mean it's going to leave behind all of that craft tradition that goes back 500 years? I don't know. What do you think?
I don't think good enough is enough. As Alan Kay would say, good is the enemy of great. I think that there's a lot of craft in digital media. It's maybe not really in publishing yet, but there's a lot of evidence that people spend a lot of time working at craft. We've seen it a lot in this conference. A lot of people are getting right down to that granular level of pushing pixels, as we say at our school, and making sure that those pixels are going in the right direction. And what we hope to do is tell you a little bit about how we like to present the problems that we see in digital publishing to our students. It seems like publishers are going for the quick and easy. They're looking for a platform, they're looking for a way of getting all of their text flown into systems, and those template-driven systems, we know, they're, as John is saying, they're just good enough. They're barely good enough. And what we need to do is look at what is actually being crafted. What needs to be crafted is the experience. So quick and easy is not the way to go. Template-driven, as I said. And we've heard this quite a bit over the last 2 days, that everyone seems to be still imitating the printed page. It doesn't lead us in the right direction. Imitating the printed page will eventually lead to what you know as skeuomorphism. And if you're not sure what that is, I've been asking around whether I should provide a definition. Well, I would like you guys to think about the difference between an affordance and a skeuomorphism. So an affordance, here's our official Wikipedia definition. I won't read that, but we know that a doorknob affords us the twisting action. But in the HCI world, or the interaction design world, affordance means how discoverable is that action. So we don't want to have people guess as to how to use something. And so an affordance is actually a good thing, right? A skeuomorphism, not so good thing. It's when that affordance goes wrong, when you take an ornamentation and you bring it way past its format. And the most famous example of an affordance is the infamous page turn that we can't seem to get away from. These skeuomorphisms, they limit us. They limit our sandbox. They don't let us actually imagine what would be the most ideal way to present content. So in the perfect world, an affordance is a metaphor. It's used, in a subtle way. But when these metaphors are used heavy-handedly, they become skeuomorphic. So on to the handcraft of the web. This is the area that I've lived in for the last 20 years. I've spent a lot of time as a designer working at crafting unique experiences for the web. And so I want to spend a little bit of time talking about how to do that in a way that a lot of designers already do that I just don't feel like it's really there in publishing yet. So I'm going to show you an example that's actually spans back over 10 years ago now. And I had the good fortune of working at CBC's Radio 3. It's a really small department that had a really simple mandate. We were trying to reach a young audience. The CBC had realized that they had an incredibly growing older audience, and they needed to find a way to speak to them. So we started by making radio. We quickly moved to the web, and this is the 100th issue of Radio 3's digital magazine, we called it. And the reason I'm showing you this is because it was experimental. Yes, it was built in Flash. I would never have built it in Flash unless I knew it was the right thing to do at that time. It was the only thing that let us as designers mash all these layers of information. I liked what Albert Tan said this morning about layering information, and that's really the best description of Radio 3. It managed text as kind of its primary content type, as well as image, as you see, and a soundtrack throughout. And over the years, so we made this 100-page book, magazine, every week. And we went out and found the content for it and massaged the content so it was appropriate for the web. And it did well. It did really well. It was actually recognized more outside of Canada than within. But the things I want to point out is that we were really trying to find that right balance between text, image, sound. And what we found was just finding the right balance wasn't good enough. We had to provide control for the user to actually decide what balance they wanted. So they were able to choose whether they want text to be the foreground or they wanted the soundtrack to come to the foreground. And so after a few experiments, we found that if we allow those controls, this will make for a better experience for them. So the only thing with this was it was a closed platform. It was not very semantic, but you know, this is 10 years ago. There wasn't much going on there. It was also pre-social web, and so if we were to do this again, we would definitely move into more of a collaborative model. Although the people that pitched ideas to Radio 3 were all outside of our department, and we'd bring them in and massage their content. So I want to move on to another example that is one I worked on last year, and I'll quickly just go through it because we're running out of time, but you've probably heard this term so many times now you're going to roll your eyes, but this is yet another social book. But rather than provide a platform, myself and Alex Samuel, who was working at the university with me, we decided that we wanted to make a small system, something that uses open source tools that could easily be replicated for other people to use. Our intention has always been to just be able to put all of this source code up on GitHub and have people replicate it. We had some questions. We received a grant from the Canadian government to work on this, and what we found was that commentary, and most of you guys know this at this point, commentary is literally marginalized, and what we wanted to do is integrate it back into an original text without it being disruptive. So here's a quick sneak preview of that book. It's a book that Alex has written in blog form on not long ago, and we're turning into a book. And every article or chapter asks a leading question, and we want to make sure that this is open for our audience to bring into it. So I'll just quickly run you through some of the screen grabs from the app. This is the navigation system that you pinch through to get down into, it's based year to year, taking us into the 80s and into 1981. There's the page. If you scroll down this page, you'll see these folds in the text. It's a little bit like what Bob showed earlier. You'll be able to pinch open the original text and comment into it. And we used a really simple system to build this. We used WordPress as the kind of content repo, and also the thing that ended up managing all the membership and the commenting and the moderation of the commenting. So we're going to be releasing this as source code on GitHub fairly soon. But I just wanted to show this as an example of how we were crafting this experience from the existing tools that are out there in the world. I don't want to stay on the slide for too long because we're at the end of our time, but I want to get back to the teaching of this craft thing. So, John?
The web is 23 years old this year. This is already a mature tradition. So there's a 500-year tradition of print. There's a 20-year tradition of the web already. When we teach, in the publishing program that I'm part of, certainly Haig in the design program that he's part of, we're we're bridging that gap. We're trying to bring the old craft tradition and the new craft tradition today. I used to see myself, a decade ago as I was the I was the techie guy that could explain the web to publishers. But I'm almost shifting now into this different role, where now I'm explaining what publishing is about to a younger generation of people who are actually much more technically and technically savvy. And I think that's, Haig's kind of similar thing, trying to bring the tradition of the book to a bunch of interactive media people. What we try to do in our teaching to bring that together, right, is to encourage that tinkering, bricoleur, experimental hacking kind of thing. I think both of us have tried to build a culture of experimentation with our students to try to animate and reanimate that craft tradition, that idea of being able to delve into this rich repository, if I can use that word, of knowledge and wisdom about how to bring these things together, to make people want to have an intimate, intrinsically motivated, deep sense of connection with the material and the kind of things that they're building, rather than a cookie cutter, paint by numbers way of building the publishing systems for the 21st century. And so I think that's what we'd like to end with, is a call to help us restore that craft tradition and build a bridge from the old one to the new one. Thanks. Okay, where's Hugh? Hugh McGuire.
Leave that one. Don't make it easier, faster than 20 minutes. Okay. So hi, my name's Hugh McGuire, founder of LibriVox, which is an open source audio library of volunteer-read public domain books, and Pressbooks, which is an open source book production tool built on top of WordPress. Those of you who've seen me speak before, I often talk about pretty I guess, abstracty kinds of stuff, and going to talk more about some of my experiences in the trenches of what it's like building a publishing workflow tool. And I was thinking, as I was listening to John and Haig, I think that I'm perhaps the enemy of craft here because I'm a big fan of good enough, but I'll just let them know that there are a lot of publishers who don't agree with that right now. So that's my Twitter-y stuff and the website of Pressbooks if you'd like to make books really easily. So Pressbooks, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, is a content management system and export system for books. So it's built on top of WordPress. We've totally rebuilt WordPress to make a system for creating books, outputting EPUBs, MOBIs, and PDFs, as well as a web version. And our front page looks like this, and I won't bore you with the inside of it. But again, we just kind of, you put your content in once, and then we handle all the conversion to get the stuff out the other end. And started Pressbooks, 2013? I think we cobbled together an alpha in 2011, so it's been a while, and been really excited about certain things about Pressbooks. And there are a few things that I find really interesting about Pressbooks and what we've done so far. The first thing is that all Pressbooks books have a native web version straight out of the box. Because we're built on WordPress, it's very easy to, it's just built into the system that you've got a web version of the book right from the start. Whether you make that publicly accessible or not is up to you. Here's a book I did with Brian O'Leary, published by O'Reilly, and probably lots of you guys in the room here contributed to the book or perhaps have read it. What we found about the web versions of books is that publishers really don't care about web versions of books, authors really don't care very much, and readers mostly don't care, although I would say that that book got, I think it's probably over its lifetime, it's had 30 or 40,000 visitors to the site reading articles, and I see often in Twitter someone pointing to one article or another from the book. So it has had a certain value, but generally when we talk about a web version of the book that comes out of Pressbooks, the eyes of publishers either light up in fear or roll back in boredom. Another thing really exciting, I announced last year at this event that we were going to open source Pressbooks. It's built on top of WordPress. I'm a long advocate of open source and kind of a believer in the cause of open source. Pressbooks is on GitHub, so you can download the whole thing and wrangle with it and get it installed on your WordPress system. It's not the easiest tool to get up and running. But we found also that publishers, authors, and readers really don't care about open source at all. The third thing, and this is the thing probably that excites me more than anything else in the world of books, is that with an online system, a content management system where your whole book is in a structured format that you understand, you know what's a title and what different things are, you could tag it very richly in the content itself, and you would have an automatic, very powerful web-based API that you could expose in different ways to users. This is a book that actually no longer exists on the web and in fact wasn't built on Pressbooks, but it's Dracula Dissected, done by a friend of mine, where he took the text of Dracula and split it up into component parts that were all navigable on a website. So it's the whole text, but he split it up by character, by date, by location, tagged it all, and you could navigate in different kinds of ways. I think it's a very interesting idea to start thinking about how we can interact with books in the future, and interesting to hear discussions of that earlier today. We also found that publishers, authors, and readers really don't care at all about books as APIs, except Kate and Megan, who are both here today, who I got an email in my box today from the publicity department at Doubleday Canada, which said, Kate Pullinger launches book as API, and I thought, I bet you I'm the only person on this email list who even knows what that means. But it's great to see some people doing some really interesting experimenting here. And I think also it's fair to say, when I talk about books as API not being important, it's really in the trade world, academic publishing, but when you get into medical reference textbooks, et cetera, there's certainly APIs are important parts of how they think about creating their books. And here's the other thing. Oh, by the way, Pressbooks is also a single source book production system that produces PDF, EPUBs, and MOBI. Now this actually is interesting to publishers, authors, less so to readers. And publishers and authors really want to hear more. Readers, of course, don't really care about how the sausage is made. And the really exciting thing to me is that all of those formats, web, EPUB, MOBI, and PDF are all generated from HTML and CSS, which also publishers, authors, and readers don't care about at all. So the conclusion I come to after a year since we launched Pressbooks as open source is that really publishers and authors are interested in ways to save money and make more money, and that that's really the thing that drives their decision making. And I think it's fair enough that generally authors and publishers are doing what they're doing, at least in large part because certainly on the publisher side for financial reasons. And also I would say the kinds of authors and publishers that we're talking to, it tends to be either self-publishing authors or small presses doing, let's say, up to 50 or 100 books a year or 10 books a year or something like that. So it's possible that there are larger, more interesting publishers that just haven't been talking to Pressbooks all that much. So that's kind of an introduction to some of the experience we've had at Pressbooks, and I'm now going to go into something just a bit more concrete. And I have a spelling mistake there on Otto von Bismarck, but the famous thing, if you like laws and sausages, you should never watch either being made. And I don't know if the same can be said of making books, but I'm going to talk about just some experiences we've had on the PDF side of building books with CSS and HTML. And I think, it's kind of this funny place we're in. I've had this conversation a few times over the last couple of days that all of us, I think, are deeply committed to the book itself. And many of us come from the world of the web, and we're sort of trying to bring these two traditions together. And something that's been the most exciting thing for me from this whole process is to take a very webby interface and to be building print outputs out of that and to be tinkering around with the designs of books. So I'm just going to show you a couple of examples of things that we've been doing, outputs using a template system from Pressbooks. So this is a group out of the UK called Connell Guides. They do these really great, very short books about 100-page books about various Shakespeare's plays, etc. And so this was one of the first sort of complicated themes we did for PDF output with some colors, images kind of cool, started to do backgrounds with colors, text boxes with funky colors, and a bit more colory stuff. So I don't know how well you can see any of that, but it was kind of interesting to start realizing how much of the world of CSS we could start pouring into actually print output. There are a couple of tools that we use. A tool called PrintsXML as our PDF generating engine. There's another one called Antenna House, which I think Atlas uses, and there's some open source ones out there. Prints is proprietary, but the amazing thing is how much you can start doing with, especially the new Page Media CSS3 that's out there. How much power you can get in creating books. So here's another book, which is a much more traditional book. We did this with University of British Columbia Press. It's not quite finished yet, but it's in process. So this, again, is a very traditional academic book, collection of different authors contributing to the book. And what's a bit challenging about what we're doing, maybe I'll just run through and show you some neat things. So there's table of contents laid out. Of course, this is all laid out automatically, straight out of Pressbooks. And we're pretty happy with how the design came out. We got a spec for what the design should look like and came very close to matching it. And I'm going to get to some problems that we have in the system, but you can do different running headers, put your page numbers wherever you want. Can handle floating figures, can even flip tables around on their side. That was fun. Right, okay. So I guess the point here is that you can get to a very good print output using CSS and HTML, and that's pretty interesting. And one of the powers of this is that you might have different content from using the same template. And so you might want chapter numbers sometimes, you don't want chapter numbers other times, you want to get rid of the subtitle, get rid of the chapter numbers, and then you might just apply a different template altogether. So this was a template that was actually built to do cozies, so Agatha Christie mysteries, but we can also apply it to long, boring academic texts about the security situation after 9/11 in Canada and the US. Another output there, and we see a little problem that I'm going to talk about shortly at the bottom of that page. More output. So the idea that you can decouple that presentation layer from the content itself is really exciting, and it's amazing how much power there is already in the CSS spec, and thanks to W3C for pushing that along. But there is a catch, and that the CSS doesn't yet handle fine-tuned typography very well. And there are a few things that keep coming up as we show publishers and say, I'm not a typographer, by the way. So when I show them stuff, I say, look how amazing this is. And they say, oh, but that comma is in the wrong place. And the kinds of problems we have are widows, orphans, especially bottom balancing. That's the biggest problem we see. Some bad breaks and flowing text around strange stuff like that inverted table. So widows and orphans can be controlled. I'm going to get into some CSS stuff here. Don't have too much left. But anyway, widows and orphans can be controlled in CSS. It works really well. But there's this big penalty that you get in bottom balancing. Who knows what bottom balancing means? Anyone? Yes? I learned it just a few months ago when I was getting criticized by one of our publishing clients. So here's an example of what happens. You see at the bottom there's 2 lines left there. So we're saying, no, we don't want an orphan here. So you don't want to leave a line on its own at the beginning of a paragraph, at the bottom of a page. So the system says, OK, we'll make sure there are 2 here. And then at the bottom here, there's another paragraph on the other page. So if they have that sentence, you're going to have a problem with a widow, which would be a sentence left over at the bottom of the page. And so far so good. We've solved widows, we've solved orphans, but the result is bottom balancing is off, so your pages at the bottom don't line up. So this typographer sees this and they go, that's not good enough. My craft genes say no. So figuring out how to fix this, I think, is going to be important for the W3C folk and those who want to solve using CSS as a true print production mechanism. Now, there are ways to do this. You can turn off your widow and orphan settings. And here we see we've got an orphan at the bottom of the page. And I don't know if you can see this, but you can apply a span up there to loosen up the text in this paragraph up here that's going to drop that down so that you lose your orphan at the bottom. And you do that with some, some CSS that looks something like this. The other thing you could do is tighten up that paragraph so that the next sentence comes along from the next page, and you do that with a tight class that might look something like this. So again, my plea to the W3C, if you can figure out how to solve bottom balancing with CSS, we're a long way to having publishers saying, wow, this really is an awesome print production tool. And it might happen anyway. I think there's sort of this, as the world evolves, we're going to see a improvement in print technology from templating systems and a adjacent reduction in requirements for tightness or fine-tuning of typography. So that really is all I wanted to talk about, was just some in-the-trenches stuff as we're evolving. And it's very interesting as I find myself up here talking about some really nitty-gritty details of print production. And I've been reflecting over the last few days about what the conclusion is of this. And I think, again, we've got this group of people who are deeply committed to the idea of the book, to the book as a metaphor, to the book as a cultural artifact, but who are also deeply committed to the web and technology and evolving the world. And I have this feeling as we struggle with Pressbooks to get close enough to what a lot of publishers need, and as we see what's going on in the world, this very slow movement, and I think in the publishing space towards changing the way we think about books. And it's been a theme, certainly last year, as John mentioned, there was this moment where we sort of shed this, you know what, screw the old publishing companies, we're going to go off to the future with all sorts of new and exciting directions. And I think that's what's going to end up happening, and it's places like Wattpad where really the concerns about bottom balancing are the furthest things from the minds of all the millions of kids who are writing and adults who are writing original fiction and interacting and nonfiction on sites like Wattpad. So I think that there's a risk as we really try to force the craft on this culture of the book that it's going to be left behind by the rest of the universe as it moves away because of this slowness to adapt to what people are wanting and needing in greater numbers. So I think that's it for me. Thank you very much.
The least technical dude in the room, unfortunately, upgraded to Maverick 2 days ago, leaving him with a keynote that is incompatible with the other keynotes. So much of what I'm going to say has in some ways been partially prefigured by various people who've spoken today already and yesterday. And to some degree, I'm going to attempt to do a sort of an improvised verbal version of one of Bob's textbooks in which I'm going to allude to a talk and say, right, that 5 minutes of that talk is what I'm referring to, so I'm going to skip ahead. To begin with, I'm going to allude to Corey's talk at the beginning of the day, and say that I'm going to start, of course, my talk about post-industrial times by talking about pre-industrial times, but I'm not going to go quite as far back as Corey. So I'm not going 2.7 million years ago to when we first used a tool, but instead to the era of writing, but before it could be industrially mass-produced. So that's an era when we have culture, the medieval period. We have words, we have multiple alphabets, and we have hordes of monks transcribing. We had a time when writers made a living simply by being able to read and write. It was, in many respects, the golden era for a writer as an economic entity, the one point in human history when writers were guaranteed an income. They were paid very well, in fact, by the standards of the time. But the role of the writer at that particular point was not to be a thought leader, not to be a conjurer of words or a conjoiner of disparate ideas. The writer basically was a machine, a conduit through which the word of God or the word of the myths of their locality were preserved and for posterity, and to a very limited degree distributed, but mostly just preserved. The writer, effectively, was the printing press, a trained scribal laborer, as one academic called them, a calligrapher. So the advent of the book in the form of bound typeset pages was catastrophic. The writer was suddenly like John Henry faced with the machine for carving away at the coalface. The entire universe of writers of the time were effectively out of a job. They were unemployed. The demand for writers vanished. Yet somehow, the supply of writers did not decrease. So it goes completely against the general microeconomic understanding of supply and demand. In fact, what happens is that the supply of writers seemed to increase. The writers, all the scholars, the gadflies, the pamphleteers, the poets, all started gathering around the printing presses and treating the printing presses as effectively the 16th and 17th century equivalent of the coffee houses of London and Paris and Dresden and Venice of the 18th and 19th centuries. Now, that particular increase in the supply of writing came in part, this increase in the supply of writers, came in part because the book itself enabled greater literacy. So the increase in the supply of things to read would tend to bring about an increase in the supply of people who wanted to write more of them, irrespective of whether there was some larger demand for what that next generation of writers might be producing. And there was, of course, as always happens when there is this sort of increase in the supply of anything in our culture, is, as Corey pointed out with Socrates/Plato, we announce that the world is coming to an end because everybody can now do something and it's too easy and they're going to lose discipline. And so the reaction, the practical reaction in this particular time begins with censorship, right? The state, whether it is the Queen or King in England, whether it is various dukes and bishops in the lands that became Germany, they basically imposed laws that said that you can only print if we say so. Now that initiated, this is a decree from the Star Chamber, to thwart the great enormities and abuses of diverse, contentious, and disorderly persons professing the art or mystery of printing or selling of books. We needed to be in control of that. Now, the interesting thing that happens is while this begins as a political act, it evolves into an economic act. Effectively, the printers that managed to get, given the right by the king or queen to print found themselves in competition with one another over what they would print. And we have here the beginnings of copyright. Now, the commercial equivalent, therefore, of censorship, when not orchestrated by the state, is a cartel. And basically, the printers formed informal cartels where they all agreed with one another not to print one another's books and therefore drive down the prices of books. This is something that existed not only in Europe in the 16th century, but in the United States as recently as the mid-late 19th century, because copyright in the United States only protected American authors and did not protect British authors. So to stop printers, for the printers to stop one another from being the ones that were doing Dickens or being the ones that were doing Browning or being the ones that were doing any of the other great-selling British authors of the time, they basically formed cartels in which they punished one another for misbehavior, that punishment sometimes extending to the sort of thing that we would associate with the mafia, but more generally things like industrial espionage. So these cartels were quite efficient at imposing a form of informal copyright. Now, why was copyright so important? It was important because these printers had to spend a lot of money setting up their devices to print. There were diminishing marginal costs to what they were doing, but the price remained the same. So the more copies they could print at a given price, the more money they would make. But they had to put up a lot of upfront money in order to get there. So this kind of significant capital outlay effectively required that they would have control over the marketplace. In the early 1700s, beginning in England with Parliament, a statute of Queen Anne entitled "An Act for the Encouragement of Learning by Vesting the Copies of Printed Books in the Authors or Purchasers of such copies during the times therein mentioned," came into being. That was effectively Parliament saying, if anyone is going to run cartels around here, it's going to be us. So that basically institutionalized legally the principle that for people to invest in the reproduction of books, to make that capital investment, they needed to have a guaranteed flow of income, or a reasonably guaranteed flow of income from that capital expenditure. What it did not do, though, is ensure that there would be a demand for these books. It simply ensured that if there was demand, the printer was going to be the one getting it. What it did also not ensure, although it claimed to do so, was that there would be a supply of writers to write this stuff. Because as we've already seen from the first great depression for the world of writing, when writers' economic impetus is taken away, more of them seem to end up writing. That a guarantee of economic payoff for a writer does not, in fact, constitute their primary motivation for writing. But it does constitute a printer's primary motivation for printing. And that has extended into the present time into a publisher's primary motivation for publishing. So that was the kind of the economic rationale for copyright. But copyright never took off, for example, in Germany. until the 19th century. A part of that was because there was no Germany. Germany was 900 different principalities, bishoprics, duchies, provinces, and so most of them could only support one or two printers. So there weren't a multiple groups of printers that required protection. What you had was what the economists would call a mercantilist or autarkic approach to publishing, which is basically pirate the hell out of everybody else's books because we don't want to be spending money importing books from the city 20 leagues away. We want you printing it all. So there was no copyright. So what you instead had was not an economic motivation for copyright, but an aesthetic or philosophical motivation for copyright. You had the great movement, aesthetic movement of German Romanticism. You had the invention of genius. The word genius once referred not to an individual, but to a quality of a place or a quality of a time. What the German Romantic philosophers, Goethe being my, I know these slides have a kind of a History Channel quality to them. We'll get along to the 21st century soon enough. What Goethe, Herder, and a variety of the late 18th, early 19th century German Romantic writers and philosophers did is come up with the idea that culture, that the great artistic artifacts are not necessarily things that come from society, but that they come from the individual act of imagination. So that they situated culture not in society, but within the individual. Now, that was a polemic, and many of them actually were perfectly capable of recognizing that they stood on the shoulders of giants, that they were using words that came from their predecessors, ideas, narratives that came from their predecessors. But for polemical purposes, because they were dealing with an absence of any economic rationale for copyright being deployed in Germany, they polemically used these strategies to try to slowly get copyright laws established in Germany. Now, what's the point of all this other than giving a sort of a history lesson and getting to show slides of Goethe at the Books and Browsers conference? The point of this is to suggest that these tools are contingent. They are historically specific, and they have to do with particular needs at particular times, and that these things evolve. In other words, that copyright in an era where one does not need large amounts of capital in order to set up a book for reproduction and dissemination, that these things change, but it's also to suggest that these things have a certain longevity, cultural longevity. To use what is a component of copyright in Europe, although not in the United States, there is something called moral rights, the idea that a creator of something, of a poem or a book or a play, has a moral authority to forbid people from screwing with it, effectively. And that authority can be traced back not to sort of economic self-interest, but to some type of Kantian idea about how things ought to be in the world. And these things are now coexisting in our time. The hassle, though, is that the particular bit of copyright and of the business model of printing and of publishing that has subsisted over the last few hundred years is changing quite dramatically in our time, and that's, in this room, one of the most self-evident things one could possibly say. Now, my bridge from my History Channel slides to plain text that is coming up is Aldus, the Venetian printer, and also the name of the company that produced the PDF. And that is a moment in our time when we start shifting from scarcity to abundance. I mean, we have obviously seen in the last two-thirds of a decade, let's say, spectacular increases abundance in terms of the numbers of titles that were creating 32 million ISBNs last year. But we had dramatic increases prior to the web as a viable medium for consuming documents. And that came from the PDF, where we had the number of titles produced by traditional American publishers increased tenfold between 1985 and between 1990 and 1997, and that we can attribute to advents in desktop publishing. What we have learned from that is two things. One, that we started dealing with abundance already, so that we actually the economics of publishing may be more robust to dealing with abundance than might be apparent from some of the behaviors of publishers over the last 10 years. But it nevertheless, we do find that there are crutches that we have had from the past upon which we are still reliant. The central bargain in copyright, as several people have argued, is that the public gives up a right that they can't exploit. I can't print a copy of a book that is a nice copy of a book for myself, even if I got the PDF. So I give up my right to reproduce that in exchange for a publisher supplying me a very pleasurable reading experience. And what we are now facing, as the last 2 days have shown, is that this is now a right that the public is being forced to give up. The public can now make copies of things that are as beautiful as anybody else can make, but copyright is forbidding us from doing so. So we are beginning to face what I like to refer to as the jury nullification point in copyright, where we are starting to lose the consent of the governed, where the public has decided that they are no longer going to continue to participate in something that did once work and did produce spectacular growth in literacy and spectacular growth in people wanting to write stuff. But they are now slowly withdrawing consent. And we can recognize this, whatever we might think ought to be the case around copyright. We have to acknowledge with laws that if we do not have the consent of the governed, we can't force it. We can't impose the death penalty for copyright infringement. So what, therefore, may be the business models that will arise to replace copyright? And how can they address the other more emotional, aesthetic, or moral side of authors' rights in a way that is satisfying? Here we have a word that basically half of what I refer to by craft. Just see what the Canadians had to say. I can't, John, I can pronounce your name, but Haig had to say earlier, which is that this refers not only to the design aspect of things, but also to all the artisanal aspects that have been a part of publishing, and not just in terms of producing finished artifacts to look at, but also the halo effect, the aura I'm using in the Walter Benjamin sense of the services that go into the production of books. And there I'm referring to developmental editing. I'm referring to copy editing, to proofreading, to covers, package design, to the sequence of blurbs, the 25-word blurb, the 75-word blurb, the 200-word description, the 300-word description, the marketing bullet points, all the various marketing appurtenances that get attached to books to give them context. And then on top of that, all the work that is being done around annotation and social reading, all those activities are service activities. that are monetizable if you're looking at it from a publisher standpoint, whether you're talking about fees for services and unbundling from the traditional publishing enterprise those capacities for providing all these services, or else if you're a publisher that doesn't wish to be unbundled or doesn't wish to be deinstitutionalized, a greater awareness of the fact that what you are providing is a series of services. As opposed to sort of a magical transformation of unpublished author into published author and the perceived aura that that person will subsequently have. The series of traditions that have been discussed, in fact not just by John and Haig, but that were implied in Mandy Brown's presentation yesterday from editorially, all that craft, experience, and tradition that we use in production. A second area that I think we can look at is authenticity. Now, some authenticity can be derived from craft. The sense that there is a person, not just who wrote the book, or persons who wrote the book, but that there are other people who have made it into a finer experience. The advocacy of a number of people over the last decade to get publishers to mention the editor on the copyright page, to mention who proofread the book, to give a sense that there is a team of people that participates in it, and one which is relevant whether it is flowing through a regular publisher or not. That there is artisanal culture at work here, and that lends authenticity. But authenticity can also sort of refer to what Kickstarter has very well highlighted, which is that there is a relationship between writer and reader that can be productized in all kinds of different ways. And that can involve signed posters, that can involve a Skype call with your reading group, that can involve them offering to come to a dinner party to cook for you, that can be a tour of the city in which a particular novel or a nonfiction book may take place. And lastly, pleasure. And in pleasure, I mean, I derived immense pleasure over the last couple of days from all the intuitions, innovations, and delightfulness and joyfulness of people describing all the different ways in which they are creating beautiful experiences in relation to books. Now, one of the ways in which that pleasure can transcend into the universe of business model is something that I would like to point to in terms of a particular business model that is widely discussed right now, which is the subscription model for books, and the idea that an ideal mode for the dissemination and monetization of reading is the sort of the smorgasbord approach, the all-you-can-eat book model. And one of the things that we have seen is that if that were the case, then libraries would have put publishers out of business a long time ago. That what is going to drive that kind of activity is not the mere availability of books, just as the mere availability of songs for free on torrent sites does not seem to in any way undermine Spotify's ability to generate money, or Last.fm or Pandora. That the power of any kind of subscription model in the world of books is going to inhere in the delight of the browsing and discovery and the flow, to use the term that Safari is using within their own B2C subscription product, the ability to allow people to flow from one thing to another, to not have arbitrary barriers for readers to go from one experience to the next experience. That you can put on Spotify and I can start reading, and Spotify is just going to be the radio of my life. I can Otherwise, I have to basically download a torrent and hope that the songs that I'm going to listen to are songs that I want to listen to. That process of having a pleasurable experience, one that reflects in some ways the flow of my desires in any given day, is truly the point at which subscription models are going to work. So the genius of them is going to be in the work that you guys are doing, much more so than the world of BizDev. Thank you very much for your time, and it's beautiful to be here in the late afternoon looking at the beauty out here in the room, so thank you very much.
Questions? That's always this way. Questions?
I have a question. I want somebody else to go.
Nope, that's not fair. You've already invoked the right.
All right. So this is a very since you asked a question about W3C, and I thought of an answer. I wondered. So, okay, widows and orphans thing, right? And then bottom balancing. You could have line space. Now, is it acceptable to have line spacing? No. Oh.
No, are there typographers in the room? Anyway, if you said to stretch the line spacing, I think you'd get your beard chopped off, probably. So. Yeah.
I saw Alan raise his hand on the typographer question. I don't know if you wanted to.
We'll have a larger conversation.
Yeah.
Off the list.
There was another. Yeah.
I liked very much how between the Pressbooks talk and the previous talk about the Canadian craft, how there was this detail about the word spacing and those problems. They touched the PDF, however, but in the EPUB and in the MOBI or other kind of formats, what the craftsman has to do actually is to go on the barricades and rail against the standard communities, right?
So I actually think that, oh, right. So the question was, we were talking about the craft of PDF for print production, but what about the craft of EPUB and MOBI? So old MOBIs, kittens cry, don't even talk about that. There's nothing that can be done, and that we're just gonna have to live with that. In my opinion, some modern EPUB reading systems, and I include the Kindle Fire KF8 to be that, are actually pretty good on the typography side because they mostly allow pretty robust use of CSS, and so you can manage a lot of these kinds of problems in a browsery kind of way. So you, again, don't have the very fine touch that you would get in print, but it doesn't really make sense in certainly a reflowable metaphor. There are a couple of egregious, criminally negligent CSS attributes that are not supported or not explicitly required in the EPUB 2 spec, which I think should be, but by and large, I don't know what you guys think, but by and large, at least modern EPUB reading systems are pretty good.
Yeah. There's a whole bunch of factors, I think, that are involved in that. We came out of a system where we had 72 dot per inch monitors, and they were slow, and so, you know, proper line endings and hyphenation justification, stuff like that wasn't practical for years and years and years. We now have close to 300 DPI on our phones. We have wicked fast browsers. Last year at Books and Browsers, Adam Hyde demoed a part of the book type thing that did proper pagination, the whole 9 yards, to produce PDF in a browser window. So we know it's technically possible. I think the question goes back to what's good enough for the reading system makers.
We've got one publisher who we work with who, it's kind of a long quote and we'll get it wrong, but he said, it's amazing how much time and energy is spent in publishing, in a publisher's professional life and the team on a publishing group that has absolutely no impact on the business itself. And he was talking particularly about some of the fine-tuned stuff that typography, which he believes has no relevance for the actual business of publishing. So I think there's a balance, and I think Kindle, for all that the typographers in the universe and probably lots of the readers in the universe would like to scream at them for, they proved something was that there are an awful lot of readers in the universe who don't care either, as long as they get relatively cheap, relatively easy access to books that they want to be reading. So there's a trade-off that has to be done, and you need to know what your objectives are, I guess.
My objective is that people love their books and their reading systems. I don't know if anybody loves the way things look in a Kindle. I think that's important.
Yeah, if I could just add to that now that I'm hearing all these questions, I think it may get back to, you know, Hugh was saying that the readers don't care, but, you know, that's self-reporting. And as we know, people don't always know to say that they do or don't need X feature. It may very well be that a lot of the craft that is being discussed is the kind of stuff that is quite tacit in the reader's experience, in the user's experience. They can't point to it as something that they wanted, but its lack leaves a kind of a gnawing sense of hunger, that they sort of empty calories, perhaps you could say. It's the sort of logic around, can you taste organic food? Maybe not. But is there something around the process of creating it that may be emotionally or quote-unquote spiritually meaningful? Possibly, and that may be the stuff that comes out that's missing in the good enough logic.
Sorry to keep adding on to this, but we've solved all this, I think, mostly in the browser. There are still some problems with it, but there's no reason why an EPUB reader shouldn't be just as powerful as a web browser for typography. I do know that Hachette is now producing all its, at least novels and sort of straight text and memoirs and whatnot with a CSS-based system using prints, which is what the PDF engine that we use as well. So it's going to happen. I think these kinds of problems that I pointed out are going to be solved if there's enough push to do it. Yeah.
I think that makes a lot of sense. The paradigm-setting nature of Amazon worries me in that sense, though, because I think there's an agenda there to be the single platform for all reading, the passage point that everything will go through. Therefore, there's a sort of one set of standards that gets applied to everything, whether it's textbooks, novels, nonfiction, poetry, whatever. And I think that's where the nurturing of the craft tradition, I think, reanimates a desire for people to differentiate the market and that sort of thing. And I think that's where it seems like there's a lag going on right now that kind of gnaws at me in all those nutritional kind of metaphor things that Richard talked about.
One thing that I remember noticing 3 years ago maybe, and this may have happened 5 years ago, but I'm too square to have noticed it, was the shift in baseball hat wearing in the US to the flat as opposed to curved brim with the decal underneath the bottom that was like the MLB, this is not a pirated baseball hat, but royalties were paid to so-and-so. And that, that happens to be one of those sort of defenses against the end of copyright, is the aura of authenticity that it comes, but it also points at a kind of a product differentiation approach of you get what you pay for. So if you're willing for good enough, then that costs a certain amount, but if you want more, then you pay for it. And then the question is how do you find mores that are authentic, and how do you sort of develop appropriate business models around them?
Answer that question. So if I can summarize your question, you're saying, actually, maybe you can summarize it. I don't think I could summarize that. But if the users... So I think that this is something, okay, so the question is, how do you, there's a challenge of crafting this experience if you've got all these choices open for the user to change typefaces and point sizes and things like that, right? Roughly? So this is, I think, a problem that's partly being solved online on the web anyway, and it's by making responsive experiences, the ones that change based on those choices. So if someone changes the point size, then the line spacing and everything else changes along with that. So you get a consistent experience. It's not just one element that they change, but there's a kind of cascading of the typography. I don't know if that's answering your question.
And I would add that the craft of the underlying markup becomes the key. Liza had a tweet there, I guess, during my talk saying bottom balancing is mission critical for publishers, but they can't be bothered to get a proper bulleted list in an EPUB. And that's a problem of not caring about what the markup is. If your markup is good, then a good reading system should be able to generate a nice looking output no matter what style sheet is sitting on top of it.
I just want to throw one more thing in there. I hope nobody gets the sense. I mean, because I talked a lot about traditional printers and that sort of thing. That's a 500-year tradition of designing for the printed page, and we are now into the third decade of designing for the web, and those are two completely different things. And I think that the approach to designing for a reading system is a new and in its own thing, and it involves things like responsive design. It maybe doesn't involve the same approach to bottom balancing. I mean, bottom balancing is a very particular thing that has to do with facing pages. And it invokes that other grid thing where we want to keep the lines all of that, and it all has to do with paper. So we exchange that for a different set of material constraints and affordances and all of that sort of thing. So I think that's just a natural evolution.
It's also columnar, not just spacing. Columnar content of same page.
Fair enough, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for our speakers. Kat, can you join me for just a second? And just a reminder that we have one shuttle leaving at 5, or as soon as it's full, whichever comes first. And thank you all for coming. It's been an amazing couple days. And I'm just really thrilled to have had you all here. I think that there were several moments where, you know, at least my mental jaw dropped, or I had really wonderful insights into not just publishing, but creativity and how people are struggling to define a new world where, to borrow from the last session, we think about bringing craft into an age of digital production that's native and natural and easy. And I think really that's why we're all here. And I just want to appreciate everyone who is contributing to that struggle.
Yes, 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 yes. Round of applause for you guys too, because everybody here contributed. And the committee of Peter selected dates for next year already and has announced them, which is awesome.
They can be malleable, but I mean, if we hold true to form, which is the end of the week before Thanksgiving, then that would be October 23rd to 24th. So before Halloween. Is it Halloween?
Yeah, you said Thanksgiving. It's
oh, sorry.
like
Halloween. Same holiday.
Thanksgiving for witches.
Halloween, Thanksgiving, Christmas. Anyway. Anyway, we'll sanity check conflicts and things like that. But I mean, that's historically when we've done it. So.
Yeah. I think we're done unless anybody wants to ask more questions. Just kidding. We're done. Thank you.